clear my bias up front, and I don't think it would be any surprise to you that I think our healthcare is incomplete when we fail to attend to the spiritual dimension. It's just plain incomplete. And that we enhance the effectiveness of our healthcare by attending to spirituality. And when I present this to other groups, to hospitals, to various granting agencies, I make the point that this isn't just opinion. There's a lot of good empirical, solid research to support these arguments. So, and I try to get people to be a little defensive when they argue against it. Say, okay, show me your data. Show me your data that suggests this isn't important. And because the data are very clear that when we attend to spirituality, we improve the quality of people's lives and we enhance healthcare. So then how do we move to that more practical dimension? Well, let me talk a little bit about assessment. And I'm going to talk about 4 key aspects of spiritual assessment, which I think is an ongoing process. It's not as if spiritual assessment can be done the first visit with a patient by asking 2 or 3 simple questions. If it were that simple, we'd all be experts. The reason we need training, the reason why we develop and grow as healthcare professionals is it gets more complicated, and we all know that. So let me talk about the process of spiritual assessment. And note 4 key aspects to it. And the first aspect to it is simply setting the stage for spiritual dialogue. When we start talking to patients about spirituality, we're actually asking, I think, about the most intimate aspects of their lives. What do they believe in? What do they truly value? Who are they at their deepest level? I once handed out a survey to members of a church about their images of God and health and well-being. And I got one survey back with the questions about God all scratched out with letters big and bold saying, "I'm not answering these questions. I don't even know you." Well, okay. I probably would have had more success if I had asked about their sex life than about their spirituality. Because nowadays, people are probably far more willing to talk about sexuality than what are their core values, what makes their lives most meaningful, what do they hold sacred and transcendent. So, to create this spiritual dialogue, we have to set the stage for it. And how do we do that? I think most importantly, we have to communicate an openness to learning from our patients. An openness to learning. It's that our patients are going to teach us about their spirituality. We're not teaching them. They need to teach us so we understand what are their spiritual needs, what are their spiritual resources, what are their spiritual concerns, what are their spiritual goals and visions and strivings. They need to teach us. So how can we be taught? Well, we have to communicate an openness to being taught, an openness to learning. And to that means we need to be humble. Basically, telling our patients, I don't know, could you tell me more? I'm interested in how this illness has affected you spiritually. Could you tell me more about that? Now, the biggest impediment or barrier to that humility is the assumption that we already know. When we communicate to our patients that we already know, it's going to, no better way to shut off the conversation. So if our patient says, well, I'm Christian, you know? And you say, oh yeah, I know. What do you know? I don't know. What does that mean? You're Christian. You don't know. Christian can mean a million different things. What does it mean to the patient? When someone says, I'm Christian, you know, you say, well, what is that like for you? Can you tell me a little bit more about being Christian? That's humility. That's willingness to be taught. Or, well, I was born again. Do you know what that means? I don't. And if any of you here are born again, and you say, you tell me you know what it means for the patient who says they're born again, and you say you know what that means, I'd say, you don't know either. You can't know unless your patient tells you, because born-again experiences come in different sizes and different shapes, and they have different meanings and implications for people. Your job is to find out, what was that like for you? What is it like for you being born again? Could you tell me more? I'd love to learn more about that. That's communicating an openness to learning. It's very challenging to learn about someone else's religion or spirituality, but if you develop the openness, it's also very exciting. In some ways, I think, being from a different religious tradition makes it easier. Now, that's a really funny idea, you know? It's turning things around on their head, because you hear a lot of talk about you need to work with people and patients only from your religious tradition to truly understand, and I'm turning it upside down and I'm saying, I think that could be a barrier. Why? Because if you're from the same tradition, you may be more likely to assume that you know. But what do you know? Coming from the same tradition doesn't mean you know their experience, because their experience, there are a lot of different ways people experience being Jewish, being Catholic, being Presbyterian, being Hindu, being Buddhist, being Muslim. There are many ways people experience those affiliations. So how can you know? In fact, if you think you know based on your experience, all you're doing is projecting your own experience on your patients, which is going to create a barrier between truly understanding where they are. So humility means, no, I don't know. It may mean, yeah, I'm Catholic too, but tell me about your experience. Tell me more. I'd love to learn more. Communicating that openness to learning is key to spiritual assessment. And your capacity to listen, rather than talk so much, the capacity to listen. And you know, many of you are nurses, you have the capacity to listen. You know, that's a big part of nursing. You have the capacity to listen, and that's what makes you effective too. That your patients know you're going to listen to them and take seriously where they're coming from. That sets the stage for spiritual dialogue and everything that follows. So let me talk a little bit about the next step in spiritual assessment, which has the fancy title, Initial Spiritual Assessment. I couldn't come up with anything more sophisticated than that. But these are the initial questions that we can ask during an intake interview, when we're visiting a patient by the bedside, in psychotherapy. A few initial questions that just open the door to a spiritual conversation. They open the door. By asking a question or two, they just let the patient know that you're willing to talk about it. Now, a lot of patients don't believe that healthcare professionals are willing to talk about spirituality. Surveys show that patients think that talking about spirituality is something the patients would like to do. The majority of patients want to talk about spirituality in healthcare. Surveys are very clear. They also seem to suggest that patients are a little bit worried about offending us. They don't want to make us feel uncomfortable. Isn't that odd? Patients are being sensitive to our feelings. They don't want to talk about spirituality because they know it may not be something that healthcare professionals are comfortable with, so they keep it to themselves. By your asking the question, you're creating an atmosphere of openness and interest and saying to them, yeah, I'd like to talk about it. And you can do that in psychotherapy, you can do it by the bedside, you can do it in medical practices. Asking the question creates that openness, and then patients will talk. I remember after one workshop, a physician comes up to me after a workshop on spiritually integrated therapy, and he says, kind of annoyed, he says, do you realize how much I have to do in my medical practice? I have to do my physical history, I have to do a history about psychological issues, I'm supposed to do a history about medication, I'm supposed to do diagnosis, and now you're saying I need to do something about spirituality. This is just ridiculous. I said, you know, I brought up this question to the whole group. I said, you know, this doesn't have to be rocket science. It really doesn't. If you don't have time, just do this one thing. Ask your patient one question about spirituality. One question. That's all. If you think any of the ones, I'm going to give you a zillion of them in a few minutes. Ask any one of these questions and watch what happens. Because my experience has been, and I've had this other people tell me, if you ask one question, it opens the door to spiritual conversation. Because you've let your patient know it's okay to talk about. And watch what happens. Not every patient will go there. Maybe not even most of them. My experience is about a third will go there and start talking. But you created the openness to the dialogue. The initial spiritual assessment questions, a few of them that I recommend. Do you see yourself as a religious or spiritual person? Great question. It lets you know whether they conceptualize themselves, see themselves in a spiritual sense. Another question, what's their spiritual denomination or affiliation? So you can place them in a larger context. What is their context? What is their home base? How has your illness or problem affected you religiously or spiritually? This is a great question because we know that illness affects people physically, socially, psychologically, but it's also true that illnesses affect people spiritually. For some people, it creates spiritual trauma. You know, how can this be happening to me? I've lived a good life and now I'm suffering like this. How could this be happening to me? How could this be happening to my loved one? She never smoked a day in her life and she's got cancer. This isn't fair. God isn't supposed to work like this. How has the illness affected patients spiritually? That simple question can open the door to a wonderful conversation. And how has your religion or spirituality been involved in your coping with the problem? This speaks to spirituality as a resource. So how has spirituality been a resource to you? Again, wonderful opportunity to create dialogue. Now, how do we ask these questions? I'm not a big fan of asking them in a formal, systematic way, such that every patient is asked the same questions in the same order in a robotic fashion. Remember, we're talking here about trying to foster a spiritual dialogue, a conversation. That's how this gets really understood. You want a conversation. And to ask questions in a kind of rote, robotic way is a great way to stop a conversation. Okay, we're about to start the spiritual portion of this assessment. You ready? Are you sure you're ready? Okay. Come on, no greater way to stop any conversation than that. We want it to be woven into the dialogue. And I'm going to show you a video clip of the way I do some initial spiritual assessment and work with one of my patients who I saw many years ago who was coming in for depression. And I'm going to play this out a little bit, the spiritual portion of this case. He's coming in for depression, and I'm doing a typical first session intake, asking her, how is she dealing with her depression? Okay, and you'll see he comes across as kind of depressed. He's about 30 years old. And you'll see how I weave some initial spiritual assessment questions into the interview. And I try to do it in a way that's kind of seamless. That's not, oops.
So, Rachel, how have you been trying to deal with feeling depressed?
I keep pretty busy and involved in a lot of stuff, and the kids need me, so I do a lot at the school. The administration is mostly frustrating, so I'm always trying to work with them and meeting after meeting, and that's one way that I try to just keep my mind off of things. And
so it's frustrating, but it's distracting and keeps your mind off of feeling depressed?
yeah, and yeah, I would say that's pretty true.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I spend time with my family. We're pretty close, and they're really important in my life. We drive each other crazy too, but we spend a lot of time together. They're really important. Polish big family, do a lot of stuff together.
So spend a lot of time together doing things?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And when you talk with them about being depressed, do they know what's going on with them?
No. I don't know, burden. That's something I just, I should be able to handle this on my own, and that's one of the reasons I'm here. They don't need to hear about this. It's nothing they can do anyway, it's my problem.
You feel it would be a burden if you share how you're feeling?
Yeah. And then they feel like they have to make it better, and I know they can, and it's just not worth them feeling that.
Are there other ways that you try to cope with being depressed?
I have some pretty good friends from college and from high school even that I keep in touch with, and so we do things, like go to coffee or that kind of thing, and that's helpful. I do enjoy that.
That's neat. Do you know what's going on with you?
No.
No. Do you exercise?
I'm just so tired. I thought about it. That's as far as I ever get. I walk around school, and even that is tiring. I just don't have energy.
You can't get yourself going for that?
No.
Any hobbies, spiritual?
I really don't. I'm just too tired.
Do you see yourself as a religious or spiritual person?
No. I'm Polish Catholic, and those are both my religions, just strong in culture, strong in that background. I see him here, I go to church on Christmas and Easter with my family, and that's my religion.
Was there a time that you were more involved?
Yeah, when I was a little girl, and even up to like my early teens, I would go to church with my bushki, my grandmother, and she was just such a warm woman. We would go and sit in the pew together, and she would show me, she would talk to me about God, but since she died, I just really haven't been involved. My parents aren't non-religious, so it's more like we just need to go on these times, and because we're Polish and Catholic, so that's just what we do.
When did your bushki die?
I was about 14.
About 14 or so?
Yeah.
So are you involved in the church now?
No, not to speak of.
The spiritual assessment questions were just woven into other questions about how you're dealing with your depression. Ask about her friends, family, hobbies, are you a religious or spiritual person? So, and I tried to do it in a way that just kind of flowed into the conversation. Here's some follow-up questions, and I noticed that when she talked about her bushki, her grandmother, she kind of, only time I really saw any kind of emotion with her, she seemed to light up. But her bushki died when she was 14, so I'm going back to the history, flowing from spiritual back to family history. Then, are you still involved in your church? Nancy says, well, not to speak of. That's interesting, not to speak of, kind of Freudian. Is that really not to speak of? Which means we've got to speak about it. But at this point, I'm thinking, okay, there's not a whole lot there that she's willing to talk about in terms of her spirituality, and she's coming in for treatment of depression. So I'm thinking at this point, I'm not going to be doing much with spirituality from the initial assessment. But again, I'm trying to weave it into the conversation. And I encourage people to do that in healthcare too. If you're a physician, if you're a nurse, if you're a chaplain, it's woven into the conversation. Donald Katz, the eminent pastoral psychologist from Princeton, said that spirituality is elusive, not because it's separated from human experience, but because it's interwoven into human experience. So it's the forest and the trees thing again. It's there all the time, but you have to learn how to see it. So that's the challenging thing here, is to kind of deal with spirituality in the context of everything else. And that's what we try to do in the spiritual assessment. Ask a few questions and watch where it goes. It may not go anywhere, so you don't push it. On the other hand, just because people aren't talking about spirituality initially, or even if they're saying it's not very important to them initially, remember the metaphor of the onion? They may say it's not important. Does that mean that that applies to every level of the onion? Well, maybe not. Maybe they're saying at this point it's not important because they don't trust you yet, they don't know you yet, or maybe they're not in touch with it. Maybe they've forgotten something. Maybe at a deeper unconscious level, there's more going on than meets the eye. So you take the initial assessment with a grain of salt. And you need to be alert to the possibility that spiritual material will emerge, or sometimes erupt, later on in the treatment process. And I know this occurs in nursing and healthcare too, that initially you may not think there's much there, but as the disease progresses and as things move forward, what you assumed was going to be something irrelevant becomes very relevant and central to dealing with your patient. So how do we get to that then? Okay, well here's the third aspect of spiritual assessment. Oops. There we go. And I call this implicit spiritual assessment. Implicit spiritual assessment. And I think this is really important, and people have told me this is one of the practically most useful things of the whole workshop here. There's a kind of gray zone between people who speak the language of secular life and people who are explicitly religious. There's a language that people speak that is kind of psycho-spiritual. It's not purely psychology. It's not overtly spiritual or religious. It's a different kind of language. And as healthcare professionals, we have an opportunity to ask questions using this in-between gray language that may kind of trigger deeper spiritual connotations and meaning. Deeper spiritual connotation and meaning. And what are these kinds of questions? I know I'm not defining this very well for you, but let me give you the questions because you'll start to see what I'm talking about with the examples. I found these questions to be very useful in working with patients. Questions such as, where do you find peace in your life? It's not a typical clinical question, is it? I mean, it's not the kind of question we typically ask in psychology, but I doubt that it's typically asked within medicine either. Where do you find peace? Who truly understands your situation? For what are you deeply grateful? You hear how these are getting at a kind of deeper dimension? What sustains you in the midst of your troubles? What sustains you in the midst of your troubles? This language almost has a biblical quality to it, doesn't it? I mean, there's a deeper tone with the language of spirituality. And again, it's not language that we typically use, but I want to point out that there's no God in here. God is not mentioned in any of these questions. There's no church here either. There's nothing explicitly religious in any of these questions, and yet they provoke deeper thought. Deeper thought. I found that questions of this kind often lead to more explicit spiritual conversation. Not always, but often they do because they signal to your patient that you're willing to talk at a deeper level. So if you're a nurse and you're going into a patient's room and you're going beyond the physical questions, how are you feeling, are you in much pain, and you ask questions such as, where do you find peace in all of this? Watch what happens. Because you're signaling to your patient that you're willing to connect to them as a spiritual being. It's a message to them. And watch what happens. See if your patient is willing to go there. Some won't. Where do I find peace? I don't find peace. Well, you can go there too. So what do you do when you can't find peace in your situation? Where do you go to then? Watch what happens. So let your patient lead you into that deeper conversation. If you're willing to go there, you're signaling it by these kinds of questions. Let me give you some other examples of these kinds of questions. And we don't ask them all. You'd overwhelm a patient. You'd be kicked out of your job. But questions, again, what are you striving for in your life? Why is it important that you're here in this world? What a deep question, all about strivings. What legacy would you like to leave behind in your life? Other questions about struggles. What causes you the greatest despair and suffering? It's such a wonderful question. It's such a wonderful question because it says you're willing to go with your patient into their suffering with them. You're not trying to provide a bromide. You're not trying to just minimize it. You're not trying to placate them with their suffering. You're saying, what's the worst part of this for you? Which says, I'll talk about it with you. I'm there with you. How is this situation shaking your faith? Great question. Again, kind of suggests that you know that this kind of thing can happen. What are your deepest regrets? Now, there are two pieces to an implicit spiritual assessment. One is being willing to ask these psycho-spiritual questions. Ask these questions that open the door to a deeper conversation. Again, I just suggest be an experimenter and try one question with a patient. Watch what happens and see if it doesn't deepen your relationship with that patient. See if it doesn't do it. But that's one piece of it, asking the question. The other piece of it is becoming a really good listener for the deeper dimension in your patient's conversation with you. So you listen for this language from your patient. You listen to your patient when they start speaking this language, and so they may communicate this way to you. Well, you need to listen to it and be willing to respond to it. So it's not just you asking the question. When your patient starts to speak the language to you, you need to be willing to respond to it. And I want to give an example of that then with work that I did with Rachel. This is several months later now. Now what I learned, oh, by the way, Rachel is an actress. This is from tapes that I work with, or transcripts of the real Rachel, but this Rachel is an actress. She's very good. She's just about, well, she's a few years younger than the actual patient, and she's also about 150 pounds lighter, because the real Rachel was quite obese. Other than that, she's doing a great job of role-playing her. And what I learned over several months from the first interview was that Rachel was really coming in because she had been raped several years earlier and never told anybody, and had been dealing with PTSD and deep depression, suicidality for a number of years, and never gotten any treatment. And it had taken her several months to be willing to share that with me. So I'm asking her in this session to talk about, to begin to describe something about the rape that she was gang raped, the rapes that she had experienced. And she's struggling with it. It's taking me very painful. It's very slow work. So this is months later, all right? Now, listen to how this, and remember, this is a woman who said she's not particularly spiritual or religious. But we're going to shift to more implicit spiritual conversation, and you'll hear what it sounds like.
Rachel, at the end of last session, I left you with a hard question. I asked you whether you might be able to think about how you could begin to describe the rapes that you experienced.
Yeah. I haven't gotten very far with that. It's been a long week. I've tried sort of to think about it, but I can't really touch it. It's too big.
Really difficult.
Yeah.
What do you think's the difficulty for you in this?
something.
I know this feels really immense, Rachel, but it's really important to at least begin to put some of what you're experiencing into some words. I wonder if you might start really slowly by thinking about one word to describe what you feel like. Just one word.
Contaminated.
Contaminated. Can you say a little bit more?
I just feel so dirty. So just gross and filthy and just contaminated, polluted. It's like it grows in me, just everywhere. Spoiled.
His experience has affected you so powerfully, so deeply.
Yeah, it's everywhere. It's on the outside, it's on the inside. I have fingerprints all over me. Fingerprints on the inside. All over the core of me. The core of me is full of this. Just dirty by this. Everything is touched by this.
The deepest parts of you.
Yeah.
Is there any part of you that's not been touched by this, Rachel?
I used to believe in this pure soul stuff. You don't want to tell me about it's been desecrated. And I don't believe it. I don't even mean that it's contaminated. I don't believe it can be anymore. Because I feel it, I know it is. It's wrecked. And maybe I don't have it. I don't know. There was nothing pure in me. Pure.
Roots have touched you deep in your soul, and you're not even sure you have a soul yet.
Yeah. There's nothing pure in me. I know that.
Keep in mind now, she's a woman who said she wasn't particularly religious or spiritual, not been focusing on it. I learned she's been raped. We asked her to begin to talk about it, as we do with PTSD. And we ask people to describe the traumas and begin to integrate the trauma into their lives and experience. It's very painful work. And she's resisting. She's had a terrible time doing it. So I asked her to just give me one word. And what did she pick?
Contaminated.
Contaminated. And I listened to that word, and I'm surprised by it, because it's not, it's not a typical word, contaminated. It, to me, has that kind of psycho-spiritual feel to it, because contamination comes from the religious world, where there's a lot written about contamination and desecration and defilement and the notion that you can be dirty to this fundamental, deep sense. So I think about it, and I just go with it. I just pursue the question. And like any annoying healthcare professional. She says one word, and I say, can you say more about that? When she goes there, she's willing to elaborate. She starts to talk about how dirty she feels, how defiled she feels, how it's touched every part of her, how in a very provocative, horrifying language of fingerprints on the outside of me, fingerprints on the inside of me. And I just keep going there with her. I say, it's touched every part of you. And I say, is there any part of you it hasn't touched? Just to get her to continue to elaborate. She says, I used to believe in the soul thing, that I had a soul and a pure soul, and now I'm not sure I even have a soul. Wow. Is this a woman who is spirituality irrelevant to this case? No, she's been spiritually damaged. She's been spiritually damaged. And she's starting to use explicit spiritual language, soul language. She's talking about soul now. So we've shifted from spirituality doesn't seem to be so relevant to here's a woman who's been traumatized spiritually. And how could we then work with this case without further conversation about spirituality? I don't know. I mean, how could we help her with that conversation about how she's been impacted, not only psychologically, socially, and physically, which she has, but also spiritually, about her spiritual wounds? Now, up to this point, all I've done as a healthcare person is to encourage the conversation, that's all. It's not anything fancy. I just reflect what she's saying. I encourage her to say a little more. I reflect what she's saying. I summarize what she's saying. She's the one who's actually taking the lead. She's got the courage, and courage really applies to Rachel. She's got the courage to take this conversation into the spiritual dimension. And what I'm offering her is a listening ear and a willingness to go there with her and not try to shove her off. And a willingness to talk about spiritual issues. We're not only talking about spirituality in this treatment. I'm just showing some highlights about spirituality. I'm dealing with all kinds of other issues with her, including the main one being suicidality, because she just wants to die. There was another woman who was involved in the gang rapes who, during this time, did kill herself. So she knows that. So she's fighting for her life in this. So I'm spending a lot of time just doing everything I can to keep her alive. And we're not talking about spirituality then. We're talking about getting social support and being around people and what can she do when she feels like she wants to kill herself. And she brings me in guns and knives that she might use and, give it to me rather than to stay so vulnerable at home. So we're doing a lot of that work. This comes up once in a while. But in some ways, I think, apart from keeping her alive, this work is the key work to her treatment. But we've moved from initial spiritual assessment, which gives us one picture, to implicit spiritual assessment, which gives us another picture. I just suggest to you that as nurses and chaplains and in your professional roles, you have opportunities for this kind of implicit spiritual conversation. Just by asking these deeper questions in the non-clinical kinds of language opens the door for patients. Any questions about that? Any thoughts about that or questions about that? Okay. Let's move then to the fourth element of spiritual assessment, which is explicit spiritual assessment. The reality is, I think, that many, if not most people, have a really hard time talking about spirituality. It is ineffable. It's hard to put into words. So how do we possibly assess it when it's so hard to talk about it? We did some interviews with couples who were about to have their first babies about spirituality and the role it was going to play in their lives. And we were just struck by how inarticulate we are generally about spiritual matters. And it's not about formal education. I had a couple, and he was a physician and she was a PhD. And we asked them about the role that spirituality was going to play in their new baby's life. And the response was something like this. He says, well, we really want our child to have a spirituality and to grow up with a spiritual, religious perspective. So it's really important. And the wife says, yeah, it's like, you know, without that, it would be, you know, it's just so, I don't know, you know? Yeah, I do know. It's kind of like, you know, without it, where would we be? You know, you have to have something, I don't know, larger. It's like, you know. In between them, they had like 30 years of education. But when it came to articulating spirituality, they were really almost functionally illiterate. They couldn't do that, in part because they didn't have much religious or spiritual education, but also because the fact is it's difficult to put into words. So how the heck do we assess religion and spirituality more explicitly if people can't talk about it very well? Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, I think people encode spirituality in their heads through narratives, through stories. That's how people talk about spirituality. So if you ask people to say something, if you ask people to talk about their spirituality, you know how most people do it? They say, well, my parents were Catholic, and I grew up in the Catholic Church, and then I kind of turned away from it when I was about 13 or 14, and boy, did my parents give me trouble about that. And then I started experimenting a little bit, and I went to other people's churches, and then when I went to college, I stopped going, and boy, my parents really gave me trouble about that. And so they describe a story. They describe a story, because that's the way it's coded in the brain. We we think about religion and spirituality through this story, or the notion of a journey. That's what you try to do through an explicit spiritual assessment. You try to elicit the story. How do you get people to tell the story? And I found a number of probes useful in that regard. And here's some probes or questions that can help elicit the story. And I've got a bunch of questions in your handouts and on this. Do you have the handouts?
Online.
No? Oh, okay. Online handouts. Okay. Oops. Did I not? Okay. Questions about the past and the future. Now, there are lots of questions. Don't ask them all. Unless you want to reduce your caseload. Don't ask them all. Just ask a few. The goal is to elicit the story. It's not to answer all the questions. It's to get them to tell you the story. That's all. So these are probes that I found useful for getting the story started. So, just take some of them. What was your spiritual tradition growing up? How did your family express its spirituality? How did you envision the sacred when you were younger? What's your current spiritual orientation? You see, they're all aimed at eliciting the story and encouraging people to tell the story if they get stuck. That's all. Other questions about their goals or destination, the magnet of spirituality in their life? What do you hold sacred? Great question. I think it's even better question, what do you hold meaningful? What do you hold sacred? These are the things that matter the most. These are the things that keep people alive. If people tell you they don't hold anything sacred in their lives, then it's a sign of potential spiritual emptiness or vacuum. And that's something that needs to be talked about. Other questions? Your spiritual pathways. What pathways do people take to nurture their spirituality? What's helped? What's damaged you? Who supports you? Who doesn't support you? What gets in the way of your spirituality? These are great questions. I've developed a number of research measures of religion and spirituality over the years, but I've never used them in therapy because I think they interfere with the conversation. A standard set of questions interferes with the conversation. I've got these 10 questions I'd like you to answer. Well, what's the conversation to that? Where's the dialogue? You've just shut it off. You can ask the questions, though, in a way that fosters the conversation. So you weave questions that are relevant to the particular case and foster the conversation that way. I'm really emphasizing the notion of spirituality as a story and a journey and a narrative, and you want to learn about it. That's what you're assessing. You're assessing where are they in the story, right? How is their story unfolding? Let me illustrate this then with the explicit spiritual assessment with Rachel. And you'll see now how the conversation moves from a gray zone, implicit spiritual assessment, because there's a lot of the psycho-spiritual language kind of in between, to explicit religious language, where we're talking about God, and we're talking about the church, and we're talking about some really, really tough subjects. We're going to move into explicit spiritual conversation now. And now we're at the point, again, several months later, where she has talked about the rapes. She's begun to describe them, and I'm commenting on what I'm hearing. So we're really into it now.
I couldn't do anything. I barely breathed at night. And I knew I would die. I knew I would die. I was like, the pain was like I was gutted like a fish. And there's just nothing I could do. Nothing mattered. I couldn't do anything.
Such a horrible, horrible experience. I so appreciate your talking to me about it's a part of what's been going on, Rachel. You know, one of the things I notice as you talk, I hear you describing incredibly powerful feelings, what the experience was like for you. But I don't hear you describing anything about the rapists. That they were like, you know, where they were, what they were doing. Almost as if they weren't there.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I was so alone. It was just happening to me, and I was so alone. And I guess they were there doing this stuff, but it's like they didn't really matter. It wasn't really even them anyway. Like, they were more like messengers to me.
Messengers, what was the message they were delivering?
That's what I get. That's what I get. They're showing what I really am.
I'm sorry?
They're showing what I really am. What I really deserve.
Do you feel that the rapes are something you really deserve?
Yeah.
What do you feel that you did to deserve these rapes?
When I was 14, I had an abortion, and my mom took me, and I didn't want to. I knew it was I told her, and she told me, you have to do this and not tell anyone, and I did it. I didn't stand up to her, I just went along with it, and I knew it was wrong, and that's what this is about. That's what happens. I chose that, and God was letting me know.
What was God letting you know?
I did the most unforgivable thing. I chose that. I chose that, and that pain was the same. I was gutted. I was gutted in the abortion, and I was gutted in the rapes. It was justice.
This happened when you were 14, the abortion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 6 months before my Pushki died was my first punishment.
All right, see how the onion has been peeled? There's a lot going on here now. What starts this is I note that when she talks about the rapes, it's almost as if the rapists aren't there in the room. And she then says, well, in a way they weren't. They weren't relevant. They were just messengers. I mean, I'm not anticipating any of this. Messengers. What was the messenger? Well, the message was, this is what you deserve. For what? When I was 14, I had an abortion. I knew it was wrong, but I did it anyway. So this was God punishing me, and this is the first mention of God in the case. God punishing me. So we've got a kind of policeman God, small God image that she has here. God is punishing her, and it's a God of justice. She was gutted like a fish in the abortion, and God gutted her like a fish in the rape. But that wasn't all of it, because that was just the second punishment. The first punishment was losing her grandmother, because her grandmother died shortly after the abortion. That was the first punishment. So this is the kind of burden this woman's been carrying since the age of 14 when her grandmother died. She's been carrying this around, this trauma that was never resolved. And then the trauma is, she's re-traumatized by the rapes, which we didn't talk about for several years. And now she's coming in because she can't handle it anymore. The PTSD symptoms are overwhelming her. She's suicidal. She's overwhelmed with suicidality on top of all of that. How could you possibly work with this case and not address these issues? How could you do it? I wouldn't have had a clue. Could we just ignore it? Pretend it's not relevant? Deal with the other stuff? Well, I was dealing with other material, but I don't think that would have been sufficient. So the treatment actually needs to be reconceptualized. The treatment plan needs to include something to address the spiritual trauma and, I think, theologically, the notion that God is punishing her. And God continues to punish her. That's a theological issue too. And I'm thinking at this time that the treatment needs to involve not only me, but a priest. Because this has to do with her theology and her relationship with her church, her Roman Catholic Church. So the assessment has led to a new understanding of the case and a new direction for treatment. Any thoughts about this? About Rachel and the assessment process here? You see how the assessment process kind of unfolds and why we have to treat initial assessment with a grain of salt. Whatever you get initially may or may not turn out to be relevant. It may be, the initial conversation may not really speak to the importance of spirituality one way or the other. And so we've got these different steps to follow in the spiritual assessment. And it's something we then need to be attentive to throughout our relationship with a patient or a patient's family. Okay? Now, I've been spending a lot of time focusing on the spiritual conversation, but I want to point out in spiritual assessment too, it's also important to pay attention to nonverbals. Nonverbals. Pay attention to things such as the incongruous, inconsistencies between belief and behavior. The thing with spirituality is, it's not just a matter of words, it's a matter of feeling. Spirituality is many things, but it's always emotional. There's always some emotion about it. It's never boring to people. Let me give you an example of something incongruous that can show up, and that would be relevant. I saw this guy a number of years ago who was very upset that his wife was planning to leave him after 35 years of marriage. Now, he had admitted that he'd been emotionally abusive to his wife for most of the marriage, but he wanted my help to convince her to stay. So, and I told him, well, I couldn't convince her to stay. That wasn't my job, and I just couldn't do that. I told him what I would be willing to do would be to help him talk to his wife about his feelings, if he wanted to do that, and I'd be willing to have her come in for session so he could say what he needed to say. So the wife agreed to come in for one session. So my patient took advantage of that session, and he really trotted out a list of reasons why she should stay with him after all these years. And he had things like he still loved her, he was going to change his ways, the divorce would hurt not only him, but their children and their grandchildren. The divorce would be costly, and the wife had answers to everything. She was well armed for this onslaught of argument, and the husband could see that he wasn't getting through to her. Now, his wife was a long-going churchgoer. She'd been to church her whole life, and her husband had never been involved in the church. So the last argument he pulls out is that he's worried about the effect of the divorce on her spirituality. He says, "We pledged our eternal love to each other in front of God, and now you're breaking that vow. And that vow means something to me. That vow we made to God means something to me, even if it means nothing to you. I'm concerned about your soul." Well, when I heard it, I thought to myself, oh, Lord. It seemed to me to be incongruous. The words just didn't add up to who this guy was. Just didn't fit. But I didn't point that out myself. I said, well, what do you think about what your husband said to the wife? And she's the one who rolled her eyes. And she says, okay, you're pulling out all the stops now. She says, but you know what? Spare me. I've been trying to get you to go to church for the last 35 years, and it's been like pulling teeth. And now you have the nerve to talk about my soul. She says, that's laughable. Spare me this. And at that point, the guy broke down in tears, and he said, I'm sorry. He was very sad. He said, I'm sorry. I'm just really frightened about you leaving me. I don't know what I'm going to do. Which was the most honest moment in the therapy. It didn't change her mind, and she did leave him. But spiritual assessment also involves an appreciation for the incongruous. It also involves an appreciation for where the emotion lies. And I'll tell this story. I know John and Julie have heard this, but I'll tell it anyway, not to sit through this. But this is about a client that I had who was quite depressed, who I not so nicely labeled to myself my boring client, Joe. Joe was quite depressed. He moved up from Columbus, Ohio to Toledo, Ohio. He was an accountant. And he'd been in treatment for a while. He'd been on antidepressants without much change. He wasn't responsive to therapy. Just a lot of apathy, low energy, not vegetativeness, but just barely keeping himself going. It was very difficult working with Joe because he was so boring. How you doing, Joe? Okay. What you been doing this week? Not a whole lot. Well, what would you like to talk about today? I don't know. to basically jumpstart him, to kind of get him going and to keep him, to find something in his life that would be something he could strive for, and not going anywhere. It got really bad for me working with Joe because I told my wife, who's a clinical social worker, about it, and she suggested that I have a cup of coffee. I had never had coffee before. I was not a coffee drinker. And Joe's not his real name. It's funny, I picked Joe. When I started to drink Joe before Joe. And actually now I drink coffee and I really like it a lot. I really like coffee. Joe got me into the coffee. So I'd have a cup of coffee so I wouldn't sleep in the session. I was getting close. I did have one experience where I think I either did it or I came close to it of sleeping with your eyes open. I didn't even know it was possible, but I think I did. I think it was kind of like, not a pleasant feeling, but that's where Joe was taking me into sleep land, because he was so boring. And I told Aileen, my wife, and she suggested, well, you just gotta kind of keep pushing yourself, energy, to be there and to be really alive and present, which, this guy was so sleep-inducing. So, okay, I decided to motivate myself. Next session, come in, and I figure I'm going to try a psycho-spiritual probe. Psycho-spiritual probe, to identify some source of energy. Now, spirituality is many things. It's never boring. If someone is in touch with something spiritual, they may be crying, they may be in a rage, they may be in a period of exaltation, awe, powerful emotions. It's never boring. So I did a psycho-spiritual probe. How you doing, Joe? What you been doing this week? SOS, same old shit. That's the most emotion I ever gotten out of Joe. Good Joe. But SOS is a real warning, too. Well, Joe, has there ever been a time in your life when you woke up and you felt really glad to be alive? Glad that you've been put on this planet, on this earth. Have you ever had that experience, Joe, where you've woken up and felt just glad, grateful to be alive? What about that, Joe? And I was so scared to say, no. But Joe surprised me. He said, well, it was that time I flew jets. Joe, you flew jets? What are you talking about? Get out of here. What do you mean you flew jets? Well, when I was in college, I was like, flying and stuff. And my parents knew that, so they gave me flying lessons. And I started out with those little Piper Cub planes, and I got pretty good, and I qualified. And then I went up to the next level, and I got pretty good at that, and I qualified on that. And then I went up another 2 levels till I got to one of these small jets. And man, they're really cool. I mean, you get in those things, take off, and you pull back on that stick, and it's like, man, that baby cuts through the sky. That baby cuts through the clouds. Cuts through the clouds. You can touch the face of God. Joe, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. That is so neat. So, are you flying now? No. Why not? I don't know. I mean, I moved from Columbus and I just kind of lost touch with it. Well, Joe, we got to get you back in the cockpit. And he understood what I was talking about. That we got to get you back in the air. And we spent time in the therapy talking about what would it take for him to requalify, to get back into flying, which is what he did. And we spent sessions, over the next sessions, talking about flying, and it became a metaphor for changing his life. We talked about what are the skills that a pilot needs to be an effective pilot. You need to be organized, you need to have a goal and a vision, you need to have a plan, a game plan. You need to always be alert, and you need to get a good night's sleep. You need to have your life together. And we talked about, are you a pilot at work, Joe? Do you have those skills at work? No. he was a very passive guy. Well, he wasn't a pilot at all. But we talk about bringing those pilot skills to work, to relationships with other people. And Joe started to make some real progress. He never became a live wire, but importantly for me, as well as Joe, he was no longer boring. Because I really looked forward to talking to Joe, because he had a passion in his life. Now, it wasn't, I don't think Joe was ever a traditionally religious or spiritual guy. When he said he was cut through the sky, touching the face of God, I don't think he meant that in a religious sense. But he did mean it in a sense that's spiritual like, that he had something that was awesome, uplifting, transcendent for him. So anyway, that's the story with Joe. He was no longer boring because he was in touch with a passion of his. And that's when you have a patient who really seems to be depressed or emotionally they seem to be so disheartened, immobilized, ask them about, one way or another, ask them about what do they hold sacred? What is it that they have that's their passion in life? What's sacred to them? And you'll see that if it's truly sacred, you'll see them begin to come to life because sacredness elicits feeling. It's an antidote to depression. It's a real antidote to depression. It has something sacred. It's like the woman with the glioblastoma. She had good reason to be depressed, but she had something to live for. And when she talked about living for her son, and watching him bar mitzvah or graduating high school, she lit up. And her glioblastoma was something on the side, and all that mattered was her son. And that's something that sustained her in her life. Okay, so this is spiritual assessment. If there were some kind of easy formula that I could give you to do spiritual assessment, ask these 3 questions for every patient, and then do X, Y, Z, and you got it down, then you wouldn't have needed this talk. But I think the reason this is such a rich and challenging area, the reason we need training, and the reason we need to continue to work at it, the reason why we can get better at it over the years, if this is something we can get better at, spiritual assessment and intervention, is because there is no easy formula. We're really putting together, we're really integrating a lot of information, lots of variables that we're putting together to assess where our patients are spiritually and what do they need spiritually to grow in terms of their health and their well-being. So no easy formula, but that's why they pay us all such great money for our work. Well, maybe not. That's why it's so rewarding to be doing this work, which is true. Okay. Talk a little bit about spiritual intervention now. With our understanding of what spirituality is, and with a way of assessing it and understanding it, I think a lot of the hard work's really done. The intervention piece of what we actually do around spirituality, I think a lot of it's very straightforward, not tremendously complicated. Let me just go over some of the key elements of this for you. One of the things that we can do to help people with spirituality when it's an issue in treatment is to just create opportunities for patients to talk and families to talk. It's kind of like that field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you saw that already, dating myself. Remember, well, it's kind of like if you create this opportunity to talk about spirituality, patients will take advantage of it. They want it. Surveys show they're interested in it. They want to do it. So all you have to do is create the opportunity. I did several years ago at Bowling State University, one of my former students directed a transitional facility at the mental health center, which serves people with serious mental illness. And we were talking, and I suggested, what if we created a spiritual discussion group for people with serious mental illness? Because we know people with SMI have spiritual issues and needs. And he said, yeah, I'd be happy to do it. We need to bring it to the board and make sure they're okay with it. They, in fact, were a little concerned about it. They had some stereotyped worries that if people with serious mental illness talk about religion or spirituality, it would somehow elicit mass psychotic decompensation, that people start going crazy if they start talking about religion or spirituality. That's the stereotype, that religion drives people crazy. It really is. It's still out there. But we tried to allay their fears, and I said, look, let us try this program for 8 weeks. And we'll see how it goes. We'll keep tabs on whether there's hospitalization, decompensation, and all that. So we did. We created this spiritual discussion group for about 12 patients who have been in the mental health system for many, many years. And what we did was we just created some topics for discussion. That's how spirituality had been a resource, how spirituality was a source of struggle for them, how they dealt with their churches, issues with their churches, religious congregations, but very loosely structured conversation. We just kind of created the opportunity and then let them talk. And boy, did they talk. I mean, they talked and they talked. There was no problem with the conversation. The only criticism they had of the program after the 8 weeks was that it was too short and that they were just getting started. For some of them, spirituality in the conversation was clearly the resource that kept them going through their mental illness. Their faith in God, their relationship with their church is what sustained them through the ups and downs of their mental illness. Some of them said, if I didn't have my faith, I wouldn't be alive right now. There are other people in the group who said the exact opposite, that their relationship with their church was more painful than their mental illness, that the rejection, the stigma, the mistreatment by other, they would say, so-called Christians was more painful to them than anything. And they're still struggling with that. So talk about a double-edged sword. You're getting both sides of it. No one was neutral to spirituality. No one was neutral. We kept the group going for another 2 years without any problem. There was no mass decompensation. We weren't flooded with inpatients from my group. The only criticism, again, was that it was too short. All we did was create the opportunity. We opened the door, and people just came right to it. They want to talk about it. So I'd encourage you to think about, well, what are the opportunities in your settings for spiritual conversation, for spiritual discussion? Would it be, do you have certain patient groups? Do you have inpatient groups where you could do a group of patients to talk about the spiritual dimension of their illness? Or for the family members of patients in the hospital, do you have opportunities for family members to gather into a spiritual discussion group? Or what about you? Would there be an opportunity for, you need help? We all do. I need help. Often, a lot of help, my wife tells me, but I need help. What do we do for ourselves? Are there opportunities for us to create our own spiritual support groups where we can talk about our challenges spiritually that we face in our work? Because we need to sustain ourselves too. We'll talk more about that shortly. So something very simple. Doesn't take a lot of intense training to just be able to ask the questions, open up the dialogue, foster the dialogue, make sure nobody is dominating the conversation too much, and that it's a safe place for everyone to set up the ground rules and watch what happens. I think if people really enjoy this kind of conversation, is to normalize spirituality. Normalize spirituality as a journey that we all go through in life. It's especially important along these lines to normalize periods of spiritual struggle. Normalize periods of spiritual struggle. People often report a lot of shame and guilt if they start to have questions about their faith, if they start to feel angry at God, if they start to feel God is punishing them, they start to feel alienated or disconnected from their church. Those feelings elicit shame and guilt. And yet, they're a natural part of the spiritual journey. Very few people go through life without some questions or doubts at some point in their lives. The spiritual exemplars, Jesus, Buddha, Moses, all of the major religious figures from the world's great religious traditions describe their own periods of spiritual struggle. Desert periods, periods on the cross, periods when they had their own questions and pain and suffering and doubt. So why shouldn't we have periods of question, doubt, and confusion? And yet there's a lot of shame and guilt about that out there, and people are hesitant to talk about it. I think we do ourselves and our patients a big favor if we normalize those kinds of conversations. So basically saying, you know, you're not alone. A lot of people have those kinds of questions. You're not crazy. You're not alone. It's okay. It's good to be able to talk about it. I'd be glad to listen. Would you like to talk to a chaplain? Would you like to talk to a pastor about it? Or I'm happy to talk to you about it myself. That's a great gift. People feel so much relief in it. There's this pastor in Ohio who's developed a program just based on this whole notion called Crying Out to God. His name's Larry Zorno, Z-O-R-N-O-W. He hasn't published anything like that. But it's a program where he goes out to churches and he has members lament. It's all based on the Book of Lamentations. He has patients lament about their spiritual place in life, where they can complain to God, get mad at God, feel abandoned by God. They can express any feeling. And what Pastor Zorno says is God is big enough to hear it all. God can take all of the pain. God can hear it. It's okay. But what's really, I find, pretty exciting about Pastor Zorno is he goes first. He laments. He talks about his spiritual journey, the ups and downs of his spiritual path in his life, which I think is unfortunately all too rare. I think we'd do a lot better if we taught each other, and particularly our children, if we taught our children about what they can expect in their spiritual journeys in their lives, particularly around adolescence. If we taught our children about what they could anticipate, then yeah, there's some ups and downs spiritually in life. And here are my ups and downs, and here are the questions I've had in my life. To have our kids see spiritual models, spiritual exemplars, to help them anticipate what their lives are going to be like, I think it would be a great gift to them. Normalizing the journey, just normalizing the journey. And how many people travel a totally straight, smooth path in life? I mean, not too many. I'm not even sure that's a great life path, to live a straight, smooth path in life. It sounds kind of boring to me, but you know how I feel that boring. So it's another gift we can give our patients, is to normalize their spiritual experience, even their spiritual struggle. Okay. There's a funny thing that takes place with spirituality and physical illness and mental illness too. That when people encounter an illness, they often end up compartmentalizing their resources. We forget about what helps us get through tough times. We forget about all kinds of things. Something about the nature of stress or trauma. I remember when my wife was having our second child, and we knew she was going to go quick with that baby. And we get to the hospital, and I'm really anxious and nervous, and they were wheeling her up. I want to go up there to be with her. And the intake worker is asking me these really tough questions like name, address, and phone number. And I made it through name. Address and phone number they were just lost. I mean, lost. And I fortunately realized I had a driver's license, so you can do that. But I would say there's something about trauma that disconnects portions of the brain from the other portions that leads to multiple personality eventually. But it shows up when it comes to spirituality, that you'll have patients in treatment who may have tremendous spiritual depth and resources who, for one reason or another, have forgotten about it. The story I often tell about to illustrate this case is Bob the Good Samaritan. Bob the Good Samaritan was a truck driver who had stopped on the side of the road to help another trucker whose truck had been sprawled across the highway. And he helped the trucker get out and get him to safety. And his sun is setting, and while he's getting into safety, Bob, my patient, sees a sports car coming around the curve of this high-speed road. And Bob tries to wave down the sports car, but he can't. And the car hits the truck, the 18-wheeler, and the top is sheared off, and this young man is instantly killed. Bob stays, calls 911, stays there to assist the ambulance crew. He's a good Samaritan, but he's traumatized by the kind of graphic nature of the accident. And he's coming in, again, for PTSD. I'm working with Bob in treatment for, and he's a great guy, just a great big, beefy truck driver. He's got arms like hams. He wears those t-shirts, and he's got a great big belly, but it looks like it's made of a rock, you know, and it doesn't look like there's any fat in there at all. Great big guy, and but the sweetest guy. And yeah, he can't work. If he gets in a truck, he gets violently ill anytime he's around a curve in the road. All of these stimuli will trigger the flashbacks, so he's just disabled. We try to do the traditional PTSD kind of work, and he gets medication. It's not helping him a lot. So I asked him to bring in his wife. And Bob had never mentioned much about church. He said he went to a church, but didn't say more about it. Kind of like Rachel, not much there. So I asked his wife about resources that we may not have tapped into yet that might be helpful to Bob, to get her perspective. And she says, well, Bob, have you talked to Ken about the church? And Bob says, oh yeah, I told him I go to church. He says, we don't go to church, Bob. You're the president of the church. You're beloved in the church. I didn't know that, Bob. He says, well, yeah, it's important to me. I said, well, have you talked to people in the church about your accident? He says, no. How come? Well, it's pretty gruesome, and I don't want to make people upset. Well, Bob, have you talked to Ken about your best friend? I say, Bob, who's your best friend? He says, well, Mark. And she says, well, Mark is the pastor of the church. No, I didn't know that. Bob, have you talked to Mark about what's been going on? No. How come? I don't want to upset him. It's been really stressful to hear about it. So here he has this church that's been the center of his life. He's been the Good Samaritan to everyone in his church, and nobody knows what's going on with him. So I suggested that he talk to his pastor about it and see how that went. And it took some persuading, and I had to use this kind of argument that, look, you've loved people in your church. It wouldn't be right if you didn't give them a chance to love you back. So what you're really doing is kind of selfish by not giving them a chance to love you. He didn't like that. But it's true. He was depriving them of a chance to get back to them. So he did. He spoke to the pastor. Well, the next time he came in with his wife, and I said, how's it going? He said, I'm being love bombed. He says, they're over me all the time. He says, the pastor told everybody from church, and they're always around me. He says, it's getting to be too much. I wake up in the morning, and somebody's downstairs, and I go to bed at night, and somebody's holding my hand and giving me a kiss on my head. I'm being love bombed. Well, you could see he was really feeling pretty good about it. He was, I think, being caught up in that warm, nurturing church community. And that made a big difference, I think, for him improving. But isn't it interesting? Here he had this resource that he cut off. And that's often the case with spirituality. I work with a number of pastors in treatment and ask them, okay, well, how's your faith involved in your situation? And I can't tell you how often I hear, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, they're in a vocation. Hadn't thought about their most important part of their lives and how it's to be brought to bear with their psychological problems. But that's the way it is. So helping patients access spiritual resources. So when you ask the question, has your religion or spirituality been involved in the way you deal with problems? What are your spiritual resources? Look for ways then that they might be able to build the resource or to draw on the resource. It may be prayer, maybe meditation, maybe being part of a church or religious community. It may be nature, maybe going outside, maybe thinking about their loved ones. That all these things, maybe flying jets, whatever it is, encourage them to access their resources because it can make such a tremendous difference in their lives. When we have patients who clearly have spiritual problems, this is the most challenging part of our work. Rachel has a spiritual problem. She believes in a small God who's punishing her for her abortion at the age of 14. She also believes that she's unforgivable and can no longer be part of any religious community. And these, I think, are distortions of her religious, of her community's perspective after consulting with her priest about it. So how do we work with patients when they have spiritual problems? Well, in some cases, in your roles as nurses, for instance, you may not be in a position to be able to do much with it, other than to refer to a pastor, a chaplain, or someone who is skilled in spiritually integrated therapy. So make the referral. Bring people in who can help with the problem, but don't let the problem go untreated. Don't let the problem go untreated. We have enough data out there to show that these problems impact people emotionally and physically. So they can impact people's physical health as well as emotional health and well-being. So don't let the problem just go. Make the referral. Those of you who have some training in the area and feel comfortable with it and have an ongoing relationship with the patient, you can maybe do some of the kind of spiritually integrated therapy that I talk about in my book. And I'll just mention what I did with Rachel here. With Rachel, what I did was I worked with her to begin to reconnect to her religious community. She believed that what she had done was an unforgivable sin. Well, I checked that out with my priest colleague in the community. I have a little book with religious consultants that I use from different religious faith traditions. I have a priest, a well-known, knowledgeable, actually pretty renowned guy. He's written a number of books on Roman Catholic issues. And he said, no, she's not beyond forgiveness from the Roman Catholic Church. He says what she really needs to do is move to reconciliation in the church. And I asked, well, would you be willing to do that with Rachel? And he said, yeah. Well, it took a couple of years to get Rachel to agree to see this priest and start to begin to move to reconciliation. And initially what she did was she began to go back to her church. She said that it was a very interesting little vignette I had about a little story here, how she just happened one Sunday morning to be driving by her old church that she grew up in with her bush team. Just happened to be driving by Sunday morning around Mass time. What could this be? Just happened to be driving. She went in, and she sat in the front where she used to sit with her bush team, and she had this experience of her grandmother's presence in her life, and her grandmother telling her that she's loved and forgiven. And that really changed. That was a transformational experience for her. And that's how Rachel did not have a good relationship with God. God she thought of as this punitive being. But she had this loving relationship with the representative of God in her life, which was her grandmother, and her spirit of her grandmother. And so she had that reconnection after many years with her grandmother, and her grandmother's spirit. It made it wonderful. It was a big change for Rachel. And then she agreed to see the priest, who was, she said, a wonderful, forgiving, compassionate man who helped her in a lot of ways, but also helped her move to the sacrament of reconciliation in the Roman Catholic Church. So she's now active in the Roman Catholic Church. She sings in the choir. She's really a big part of it, and she's been able to make that shift in her understanding of God and into a larger, more embracing, loving God. And she sometimes speak of God in much more feminine than masculine terms now, which I find really interesting. Broader understanding of God in that way. She's doing much better. She's no longer suicidal. She's lost quite a bit of weight. Has been able to recover a lot from the ordeal. That's working with spiritual problems. And that does get more challenging. But I think we have a role to play there as well, particularly if we have more advanced training in this area. Okay. I wanted to spend a little bit of time with you to talk about how do we sustain ourselves in this work. I know that the work that you do in particular, and you are working with some tough situations, end-of-life issues, people with serious medical illness, family members grappling with medical illness, families that are dysfunctional, that are coming into the medical system grappling with serious illness, See, you know, you're catching people in the midst of the storm. And it's not an easy thing to do. You're only human. You're also frail. We all are frail, limited, insufficient. How do we sustain ourselves in this work? I was talking to someone on a break about just a couple of examples of imaginative things I found from working with nurses and healthcare professionals and other contexts. I was doing some work with some nuns, some sisters in a Catholic hospital. And we were talking a little bit about this, and one of the sisters, she's got to be about 4'8" on one of her long days. You know, really tiny, feisty lady. She said she worked at a pediatric burn unit. Really tough work. And she said what she's done is she's got a little condominium in downtown Detroit. And in the backyard is a very small little garden that she's cultivated. So she's got this little garden where with one chair that she can sit in with beautiful flowers and plants. And she says she goes there because the pediatric burn unit, the smell is so bad. She can go there and get the smell out of her nose. So she sits there and then she says, and I've got on the gate to the little garden, this little small 4x4 garden, I have a little sign. And she said, what the sign says? It says, keep out or I'll kill you. But what she says is, I need a sacred space. I need a place of my own to sustain myself. And that's really important for her. I had another one of the sisters said, well, she said, I'll tell you how I sustain myself. She says, what I did was I got the kids in my beds, I gave them Christmas cards. What were the Christmas cards? He says, well, the cover of the Christmas card said Merry Christmas, and then on the inside I pasted little cotton balls. And I gave them to the kids, and the kids all say, thanks for the card, sister, and then they open up and they said, what's this? And she says, oh, those are snowman poofs. So she deals with things through humor, and those are great coping devices. But what strikes me is that, and having done some following of people in palliative care units and seeing some of this firsthand, what strikes me is that what at our best can sustain us is our relationships with the patients themselves and our relationships with the family members and our relationships with each other. That's what can sustain us. And that there is, in fact, a spiritual dimension to those relationships. With patients, with family members, with each other, which can sustain us. Now, what I'd like to do would be I'd like to ask all of you to think about a moment that you've had with a patient or a family member in your work that you call sacred. A moment that you've had with a patient, a family member, or with a coworker that you call sacred. Think about it for a minute. And I'm not even going to tell you what I mean by sacred. You can define it any way you want. Think about a moment you had that was sacred with your work with a patient, family member, or a coworker. Put this together, or pull this together by asking you to think about what goes into a sacred moment. What makes a sacred moment sacred? What makes it so special? What were the qualities that you heard in these stories, the qualities that they may have had in common? What do you think? What makes a sacred moment sacred?
The memory lasts.
It's memorable. It's in some ways everlasting. These are the moments that stay with us. We remember these moments. People can come up and tell stories as if they happened a minute ago, when it may have happened 10 years ago. They're memorable. They're kind of like the un-PTSD moments, where with PTSD you remember the awful moment. Here you remember the sacred moment, the wonderful moment. Other qualities of a sacred moment.
Transparent.
Transparent. Can you say more?
Very honest moments. They're not laced with, you just see the
bare root, you see the realness, the genuineness.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think they cut beneath the surface to something that's ultimately real. We feel that we're in touch with something that's really real, that's true, that's not constructed, it's just real. And you're in a real moment. When you're having a sacred moment with someone, it just feels so true and real, where you're connected with the as Uber will talk about it, the ultimate vow. You're in touch with something ultimate, with a capital U. But I like transparency. Other qualities of the sacred moment.
Deep connection.
I'm sorry?
Deep connection.
Deep connection.
Relationship.
Yeah, there's such an incredible, all the stories have this feeling of connectedness between patients or patient and caregiver or patient and family member. It's a soul connection. You know, you're connecting not just in that kind of mechanistic way, but in a way that I see you and you see me. I see your soul, you see my soul, and we know that we know. We share that deep sense of connectedness, which is what spirituality is really all about. It strikes me odd that nowadays spirituality is seen as such an individual phenomenon, when to me spirituality is all about relationship. It's all about connectedness. And that's, every story had some aspect of deep connection between a person and a family member, person and a patient, person and God. Deep connections is a part of all of those. Other qualities of sacred moments. Yes?
Emotional.
Yes. Remember we said it's never boring? Were any of you bored during these stories? I have to admit, I saw a few of you with your eyes rolling when I was talking. And believe me, I can do that myself. But I didn't see any eyes rolling for any of these stories because they're just so awesome, uplifting. You know, they're emotionally powerful. And that's part of why they're memorable too, that they're so emotionally salient to us. You know, it's like we're holding our breath when we're listening to these stories. In some ways, I don't know if you felt that way, but I've been doing this type of exercise. I've never done it quite like this. I usually do it in small groups. But like this, it worked this way too. Talking about sacred moments creates sacred moments. I mean, I don't know about you, but I was holding my breath with some of the people who were speaking. I just thought, time has stopped. It's memorable. I'm going to remember these stories. They're transcendent. Something ultimately true and ultimately real. We are cutting through the baloney to get to deep truths here, and they are emotionally so powerful. The other quality that I think sacred moments have in common is I do believe they're healing. They're healing. They're the moments that help sustain us. Before I visited the palliative care unit, at MD Anderson, I was nervous about doing it because I really had never been on a palliative care unit. I had my own stereotypes and fears about what it would be like. And I also wondered, going there, how the heck can the nurses, the chaplains, the physicians, how can they work with people in such extreme conditions when the cancer treatments are no longer options? You know, all you can deal with is pain, and you know, hospice care may be looming on the horizon, death is looming on the horizon. It's not just a cloud in the distance, it's coming closer overhead. How can you work like that as a provider? I mean, I'm a healthcare provider, but I see relatively few people who are dying with me. I see some, but not that often. I see a full range of people in different phases of the lifespan. How do you sustain yourselves if you work in an intensive care unit? How do you sustain yourselves if you're doing constant end-of-life care with children yet? I mean, how do you keep yourselves together? So I went to the palliative care unit and I saw what they did. And I saw these truly gifted people working as a team. And I saw a few of the interactions. I was really privileged to be able to listen to some of them. And what I realized was these people, these wonderful healthcare professionals, are having sacred moments on a daily basis. What I may get once a year, they're getting, twice, 3 times, 4 times a week. And what I realized was that's what sustains this work. Because I spoke to someone, they said they don't feel a lot of burden from it. They feel honored and privileged and blessed to be in a position where they can be with people as they're going through these times. They're having sacred moments, and they keep the providers, they keep us going. And I want to kind of stress that that's something we should be alert to ourselves, that spirituality is not just, in healthcare, is not just for other people. It's not just for patients and family members, it's for us. It sustains us. But we shouldn't take it for granted. What we need to do, I think, is we need to make it more a part of our understanding, something we should be aware of, and we should cultivate it. The title of today's workshop is on cultivating the spiritual dimensions in healthcare. We need to cultivate and grow our own spirituality, I think in part by knowledge, but also by attending to the potential for sacred moments in our work with patients and families. And the understanding that really, as Buechner was saying, any moment can be a sacred moment. There's a potential for sacred moment in any interaction. If we cultivate it, then maybe we can create more of them, and we can continue to heal ourselves as we're healed by and heal other people. So I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you.